Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you how to paint watercolor peonies. Peonies are one of the birth month flowers for the month of November, and I cannot wait to show you how to paint this beautiful flower. For this project I am using a piece of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. This is Arches, and I am also using a size 10 and a size 4 round brush. I'm using my limited palette of colors. This is cad yellow, magenta, cerulean, indigo, and sap green. So we're going to start by using our size 10 round brush. I'm adding a lot of water to my brush, picking up some of the magenta and adding a touch of cad yellow to give it a warmth. I want a very light peachy pink color. We want to start with our lightest value, and using the size 10 round brush will give us the ability to create the big bulbous petals that we see in a peony. Push down with the body of the brush to create these large petals, and remember that as you're creating these very circular round shapes at the top, we're always coming down to a point. Even these side petals where we're doing more of a thin moon shape, we're bringing it down to a point, that imaginary point at the end of a cone where the stem is connecting to the flower. And then as we create these petals that are kind of on the edge of the peony, falling off, or maybe fluffy on the side, we're still creating these big bulbous round shapes and then bringing it back to that center point. So this is the front petals of the flower, and then these side fluffy petals. Now we're also going to create some small shapes in the back to represent the petals that we can't really see very well. So you can see I'm using just the tip of my brush, very light pressure, and I'm creating these very interesting odd shapes. Think of little bananas or moon shapes as they're kind of curved around the back. We still want that curved feeling of a peony petal, but we can't really see them, and so it's just these tiny little bits and shapes. So I'm moving really quickly because I want this base light color to still be wet while I add more color. So this is me dipping back into the magenta, and you can add lighter versions of magenta, more intense versions of magenta like you can see here. But if you add a magenta that is too intense, rinse your brush, tap it on the paper towel so you're not introducing more water, and then spread some of that color out. The goal here is to create dimension and interest as everything is bleeding and blending together, because we don't want the peony to look really flat and have just one color, but we don't want to get rid of those light areas we just created in the beginning. I also like to dip into my cad yellow and add a few dots for the center of the peony, just above that first layer that we did, and I like when that back layer hasn't dried all the way and we get a bit of a blend. So we're going to let that dry as we work on a more medium shaped flower. I'm doing this one a little bit quicker, it's a little bit more loose. Once again, the fan of petals in the front, always thinking about coming down to a point for the cone. You can feather some of these petals on the outside, but I think when I'm doing smaller flowers, I feel a lot more freedom to do it loose and not think about it as much. So that one went really quickly. It was a little bit too wet to add some of those magenta colors back in to get some bleed, and so I did a bud first and then went back into the magenta. It's all about timing it right so that the magenta or the additional colors are not taking over that base color that you painted. I'm even moving fast enough that I'm able to add some of the magenta down to my first flower while it is still wet. So keep an eye on your paper and see how long you can manipulate some of these colors before it completely dries. So my goal with the additional colors, especially on this bigger flower as it's starting to dry, is creating shadow, depth, interest, and not losing my light areas. So I'm trying to do the same thing with the medium flower and the bud flower, where I'm adding a bit here and there. I want everything to be diffused and blended, and then I go in with the cad yellow and add a few dots for that medium flower for the centers as well. Now there's a lot more dimension and variety I want to add to my peonies, but everything is still too wet. I don't want any more blended shapes. I want more of a hard line. So we're going to let everything completely dry while we work on the greenery. So this is a mixture of sap green with a touch of cad yellow to make it a nice light warm green, and I'm doing these little sepals, the little bits and leaves that come off at the base of the flower, but you don't want too many of them because we're not really seeing underneath this flower too much, so we want bits of those sepals peeking out. I usually just press on the body of my brush to get those shapes. Now on the bud, we can take those sepals and hug them around the bud and make them very visible and shown. It's a really fun way to paint around the bud. I love how that looks. Bringing the stems down, having them interact with each other and curve just a bit is always a really nice touch. Gives a lot of movement to stems when they can be really stagnant and straight. Same for this big flower on the bottom. We are just doing a few sepals that are peeking out, trying not to overdo it. And then we're balancing these leaves. So I have a small leaf on the right, felt like I needed a bigger leaf on the left, but that leaf, the position of it looked a little too stiff. So adding a smaller shape underneath is really going to help us with the balance. Most of these leaves I'm just pushing down with the shape of my brush, this beautiful size 10, and it's creating the leaf without me doing too much. While my base greenery is still wet, I'm mixing some indigo into my green and tapping that into the greens to get a nice blend that looks a bit like a shadow and gives a lot of dimension to the greenery. So I'm focusing on just underneath the flowers, on the stems, and a few areas on the leaves, and then letting that completely dry. I'm picking up my size 4 round brush to do the details because I don't need as much water anymore, and I am mixing together magenta with a bit of cad yellow to get that peachy pink color again, but now that we're not using as much water, it's a lot more of a concentrated pigment. Once again, I'm focusing on the shadowy areas of the flower to help me decide where to place this color. At the base of petals, maybe at the base of some of these interesting shapes in the back, as the petals are going down into the center of the flower. Anytime I place color and it's too intense, or I'm not sure if I like the hard line or where it's placed, I rinse my brush, tap it on a paper towel, and with more of a damp or wet brush, I can move that pigment wherever I want it. I can even move some of the lighter pigment into some of the lighter areas that we've saved. I can move the pigment to the edges. I'm just trying to float this pigment around. While some of those areas are still wet, I can dip back into some of the more concentrated colors like the magenta and get another moment where I'm having diffused colors. So if I dip back into the magenta straight from the well, I can get a very intense color and add it while everything is still wet. So looking for ways to create light, medium, and dark values that create texture, depth, and fluffiness without losing anything that I've created in some of the other layers. This is also a great time to create petals if you feel like some of the petals in your first layer were just a big blob. You can use a darker color to make one area of your blob a petal, and then the other part of your blob becomes a second petal. So we can kind of create dimension in that way. That's why I always say trust the process, let those blobs be and let them dry, because there's so much we can do to add layered depth later. Now we're going to do the same thing to the smaller flower that is more in bloom, where we're placing this color, focusing it in the shadowy areas, adding a bit of the peachy pink, some of the deeper magenta, and then we can use water to move some of that pigment around so that it looks really fluffy and layered, but not too overworked. Once we feel like we're starting to get happy with it, we should step back and try not to add too much. I'm doing a few swipes of color for the bud. You don't have to do too much to the bud to make it look layered. A few swipes goes a long way. To finish off the painting, I really wanted the filaments or the little dots in the centers to stand out a bit more. So I mixed some of my cad yellow with magenta until I got a deep reddish orange color, and then I dotted that at the centers of all of the flowers, just a tiny bit at the bud, because really it's not really showing on the bud, but I love the added bit of the yellow-orange color. And with that, our peonies are finished. I am painting these peonies as part of a birth month flower project, so I am writing November and peony, but there is never a wrong time to paint peonies. Thank you so much for painting this with me today. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. Please let me know if you have any questions below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye, guys.